The snow came down hard over the Laurentian highlands that January, the kind of deliberate, suffocating snowfall that doesn't drift so much as press, heavy and purposeful, like the land itself is trying to bury something it doesn't want found. Théo Garneau had lived alone on the ridge above Lac Supérieur for 6 years. Not the romantic kind of alone that people in the city romanticize over wine, talking about wanting to disconnect. The real kind, the kind that settles into a man's bones and changes the texture of his silences. He'd been a search and rescue volunteer with the Laurentides Wildlife Authority until his partner drowned in the Rivière Rouge during a spring extraction, a retrieval that Théo had called, a decision he'd made based on ice readings that turned out to be wrong. After that, he'd handed in his vest, his radio, and his sense of belonging to the rest of the world, and he'd driven north until the road gave out. His cabin sat at 900 meters of elevation, tucked against a granite escarpment that broke the wind from the northwest. He built it by hand over 2 summers using spruce logs hauled up by a borrowed skidder. The nearest neighbor was 11 kilometers down the logging road, and that neighbor, old Patrice Hébert, was 91 years old and barely left his kitchen. The nearest town with a gas station and a pharmacy was Saint Agatha des Monts, 40 minutes in good conditions and another world entirely. Théo wasn't running from something exactly. He'd told himself that so many times the words had lost their meaning. He was just living where the noise couldn't reach him. That's what he told himself on the cold nights when the wood stove ticked and the forest pressed up against the walls of the cabin, and the only sound was the wind working its way through the spruce tops like a long, slow exhale. He was returning from checking his trail cameras at the eastern edge of his property. He'd been monitoring a moose corridor for the wildlife department, a small consulting contract that gave him just enough income to justify existing, when his snowshoes broke through a crust of wind-hardened snow and he stumbled forward into a hollow between 2 granite boulders. He nearly landed on her. She was curled into the space between the rocks like she'd been placed there deliberately, her body tucked into the smallest possible shape, knees drawn to her chest. She was wearing a parka that was entirely the wrong weight for a night like this, one of those fashion-forward quilted things you'd see on someone walking from a parking garage to a shopping mall in Laval, not something built for sustained cold. Her gloves were thin, her boots were ankle height, already packed solid with snow. She had a canvas bag clutched against her torso with both arms, holding it pressed flat to her chest, the way a person holds something they're not willing to let go of, even when everything else is failing them. Théo dropped to one knee and pressed 2 fingers to the side of her neck. Pulse, weak and unsteady, but there. He didn't think after that. Thinking was a luxury. He got his arms under her, the bag still clutched to her chest. He didn't try to move it, didn't even reach for it, and he lifted her. She weighed almost nothing. It was the first thing that struck him, once he was upright and moving. She was young. Mid-20s, maybe? Her face was utterly pale, lips gone that specific gray-blue that he recognized from his rescue training the way a person recognizes a fire alarm, immediately and with his whole body. The cabin was 1.5 kilometers back up the trail. He ran most of it. Inside, Théo kicked a door shut behind him and went directly to the wood stove, feeding at 3 splits of birch without stopping to take off his own coat. He laid her on the narrow cot against the south wall, the one covered in a Hudson's Bay wool blanket and a sleeping bag rated to -30. The kerosene lamp was already burning low on the table. He'd left it on when he went out, a habit from the SAR days, always leave a light, and in its amber glow he got his first clear look at her. She was striking in the way that wilderness sometimes throws at you without warning, not polished, not composed, but vivid. Her hair was dark and wet, frozen at the ends, spread across the pillow. There was a cut above her left eyebrow, already clotted, that hadn't come from a fall in the snow. It had the clean, linear look of something deliberate. Théo knew what wet clothing did to a core temperature. He'd pulled people out of the Rivière Rouge in April. He understood it mechanically, without sentiment. Wet fabric against skin was not clothing. It was a conductor, and it was conducting heat directly out of her body into the January air of his cabin, which, even with the wood stove now roaring back to life, was still barely 6 degrees. He reached for the zipper of the fashion parka. Her hands came up so fast it startled him, both of them, slamming down over the canvas bag at her chest, her eyes flying open. The eyes were dark brown, dilated wide, and absolutely terrified in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. It was a different kind of terror. Older, more specific. Non. The word came out cracked and barely audible. Then switching instinctively, no, please, don't. You're hypothermic, Teo said, keeping his voice flat and even the way he'd been trained. Your core temperature is dropping. I need to get the wet layers off you. Don't. Her grip on the bag tightened. Her knuckles were white. Please. If you open it, if anyone sees what's in here. She stopped herself, pressing her lips together, shaking her head. The shaking of her whole body was visible now, violent and uncontrolled. You don't understand what you're getting into. Teo sat back on his heels and looked at her. In 6 years on this ridge, he hadn't once been pulled toward another person's trouble. He'd chosen this life specifically because it had no entanglements, no decisions that affected anyone but himself. But he also recognized what he was looking at. I've pulled bodies out of this river in April, he said quietly. Twice. Men who thought they had more time than they did. You don't have more time than you think. You have less. He held her gaze. I don't care what's in the bag. I'm not going to touch the bag. But I need to get the wet parka off you and the shirt underneath it, and I need to do it in the next 4 minutes. She stared at him. Her teeth were chattering so badly the sound of it filled the cabin. Then she closed her eyes. Her hands released the bag slowly, fingers uncurling one by one, and she turned her face toward the wall. Teo unzipped the parka and eased it off her shoulders. Beneath it was a thin thermal underlayer, completely saturated. He pulled that off too, quickly and without looking at anything except what needed to be done, and then he stopped. The canvas bag had shifted when he moved her. It had fallen open at the top, not because he'd touched it, but because the zipper pull had caught on her parka as he removed it, dragging it back 3 inches. 3 inches was enough. He could see the edge of a folder inside, a manila folder, thick with papers. And clipped to the outside of the folder, partially visible, was a laminated identification card bearing the logo of the Autorité des Marchés Financiers, the Quebec Financial Regulatory Authority. The name on the card read, No Ami Charand, Analyst Senior, Division des Inquiries, a senior analyst in the enforcement division. Teo sat very still for a moment. Then he wrapped a sleeping bag around her shoulders, tucked the Hudson's Bay blanket over that, and went to the stove to heat the water for broth. He didn't say anything for a long time. He got the broth into her slowly, tilting the tin mug to her lips every few minutes, watching the color return to her face in increments, the gray-blue receding, something approaching human pink re-emerging underneath it. He added 2 more splits to the fire. He gave her a pair of his wool socks and a flannel shirt that swam on her. He did all of this without asking questions and without speaking, because he'd learned in 6 years of solitude that silence was not an absence of things, but a presence of them, and he wanted to know what she would do with it. After 40 minutes, she spoke. You saw the card. It wasn't a question. The zipper caught on your parka, he said. I didn't open anything. She pulled the sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders. She was sitting up now, back against the log wall, the canvas bag resting in her lap with both hands resting on top of it, not gripping it anymore, just resting there. Does it matter? Probably not. He poured himself a mug of chicory and sat down on the 3-legged stool across the cot. You want to tell me what a senior enforcement analyst from the AMF is doing frozen into a rock hollow 11 kilometers from a paved road in the middle of January? Noemi looked at him for a long moment. She had that particular quality of stillness that very frightened people sometimes have, not calm, but exhausted past the point where fear can express itself physically. You know what the AMF does? Financial crimes, securities fraud, market manipulation. I've been working in investigation for 14 months, she said. 18 months if you count the preliminary work. A Ponzi scheme, structured as a private equity fund, marketed almost exclusively to retirees and semi-retirees in rural Quebec. Laurentides, Lanaudière, Mauricie, people who'd saved their whole lives, teachers, farmers, a lot of nurses from the CHSQ. She paused. The fund manager's name is Armand Quevillon. He runs it through 3 shell companies registered in New Brunswick, with a 4th holding company in the Cayman Islands. On paper, he's untouchable. In practice, over 437 investors have lost a combined total of $62 million. The number sat in the cabin like a physical thing. You have proof, Teo said. I have everything. Her hands pressed down on the canvas bag. Wire transfers. Internal communications. A whistleblower affidavit from Quevillon's own compliance officer who came to me 8 weeks ago. A complete reconstruction of the fund's actual asset holdings versus the statements sent to investors. She exhaled slowly, enough to charge him, convict him, and get at least partial recovery orders in place for the investors within 12 months of trial. So why are you here? Because 3 days ago, the whistleblower disappeared. Noami's voice stayed level, but something behind her eyes shifted. His name was Gauthier, 44 years old, 2 kids. He missed a scheduled check-in call. Then his car was found at the Terminus Voyageur in Montreal with his phone inside, turned off, battery removed. She looked down at the bag. The same day Gauthier disappeared, I got a call on my personal cell. Not my work line, my personal cell, which is not publicly listed and is not associated with my name in any AMF documentation. The voice was a man I didn't recognize. He told me that the file needed to go away, that if it didn't, things would become difficult for the people in my life. Your family. My mother lives alone in Sherbrooke. My younger brother is at Université Laval. She said it without inflection, which told Teo everything about how much effort that neutrality was costing her. I went to my supervisor the next morning. He told me to document the call and that he'd escalated to the SPVM and the Sûreté du Québec. That was 3 days ago. Yesterday afternoon, my supervisor called me at home and told me the investigation was being suspended pending an internal review of methodology. She let out a short, humorless breath. 14 months. 1437 victims. And someone made one phone call in the right direction and the whole thing paused. Teo set down his mug. Someone in your organization, or someone with enough reach into my organization to make one conversation happen at the right level. She met his eyes. I took the file. Everything. Every physical document, every printed communication, every piece of paper Gauthier gave me. I put it all in this bag, I got in my car, and I drove north because I needed to get it somewhere that wasn't my apartment, wasn't my office, and wasn't anywhere connected to my name. She paused. I wasn't supposed to end up in a rock hollow in the dark. My car went off the logging road about 4 kilometers south of here. Black ice under fresh snow. I've been walking for almost 2 hours. Teo was quiet for a moment. The wood stove ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the spruce with a low, continuous sound like breathing. You walked 4 kilometers in those boots, he said. She looked down at his wool socks, which were enormous on her feet. I didn't have a better option. No, he said. I know what that's like. He stood up and went to the window, looking out at the darkness. The snow had eased to a fine sifting fall, the kind that would fill in a set of tracks in 40 minutes and a road in a few hours. By morning, the logging road would be completely impassable without a machine. Quevillon, he said. Armand Quevillon. You know him? I know of him. Teo turned back from the window. He owns a property about 30 kilometers north of here. A hunting compound, 4 buildings, a private airstrip. I've flown over it on wildlife survey work. He has a contractor up here every summer doing maintenance. He paused. He does not strike me as the kind of man who loses $62 million of his investors' money and doesn't know exactly where that money went. He knows exactly where it went. Noemi's voice was very quiet. That's rather the entire point. Teo crossed back to the stove and poured more hot water into her mug. He did it without asking. He'd noticed she hadn't finished the first round of broth, which meant she was still fighting nausea from the cold, a sign that her core temperature hadn't fully recovered yet. "You need to sleep," he said. "I can't." "Not for long. 4 hours. Your body is still in recovery. If you try to make any decisions in this state, you'll make bad ones." He pulled a second blanket from the cedar chest under the window. "The door has 3 locks. 2 of them aren't visible from outside. No one is driving up that logging road tonight in this weather. No one knows this cabin exists except old Patrice Haybert, who's 91 and hasn't had a working phone since September." She looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exhaustion and the kind of wary assessment that people develop when they've learned not to trust the reasonable-sounding thing. "Why are you helping me?" It was a fair question. Teo thought about it honestly for a moment. The way he'd learned to think about things in 6 years of silence, without the reflexive answer that came from wanting to appear a certain way. "Because I made a call once that I shouldn't have made," he said finally, "and I've been here ever since, very carefully not making any calls at all." He set the blanket at the foot of the cot. "Maybe I've been careful long enough." She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she lay down, curling onto her side with the canvas bag tucked against her chest, and within 7 minutes she was asleep. Teo did not sleep. He sat at the table with his topographic maps spread out. The 150,000 sheets for the Laurentides Wildlife Reserve, the ones he'd annotated over 6 years with terrain notes and trail markers. And he thought about the private airstrip 30 kilometers north, and about a man who had 437 reasons to make sure that canvas bag never reached a courtroom. At 0340, Teo heard the sound he'd been waiting for without knowing he'd been waiting for it. Engines. Not 1, 2. The particular low grind of diesel trucks working a poor road in low gear, which meant they weren't on the main logging road. They were on the cut line, the unplowed access track that branched off 3 kilometers south and wound up through the timber to within 400 meters of his property boundary. He was at the window with his binoculars before the sound fully registered consciously. 2 headlight sets, moving slow. Stopping. A door. Voices, too distant to make out words but close enough to read the cadence. Organized, deliberate, communicating. Not lost hunters. Not a family emergency. The cut line in January at 03 in the morning was not something that happened accidentally. Teo went to the cot and put his hand on Noemi's shoulder. She was awake before he finished the gesture. "They're on the cut line south of here," he said quietly. 2 vehicles. They'll be at the tree line in 20 minutes if they come on foot. He watched her face move through the calculation. He could see the exact moment she arrived, at the same conclusion he had. Someone had tracked her car to the ditch, found the direction of her tracks before the snow filled them, and followed the most logical route uphill. "The file," she said. "The file is the only reason they're here," Teo said, "which means as long as it exists and is verifiable, destroying it doesn't help them. It creates a martyr narrative and a missing evidence flag. What they need is to recover it intact and make it disappear quietly." He was already pulling on his outer layers, which means they need you alive and cooperative long enough to tell them where everything is, or to sign something, or to simply be discredited. He handed her the heavier of his 2 spare parkas, a proper one, expedition weight, too big for her by 2 sizes, but genuinely warm, which means we have a window. "A window for what?" Old Patrice Hebert has a ski-doo. He's 91 and he doesn't use it anymore, but it runs because his grandson services it every fall, and Patrice won't let them take it away because he says he'll need it someday. Theo pulled on his balaclava. He also has a landline that is actually still connected because Bell never got around to cutting the copper wire out here. I've been meaning to use it for an emergency for 6 years. I'm going to use it now. To call who? There is a journalist in Montreal named Isabeau Tremblay-Cote. She covers financial crime for Le Devoir. She is not connected to the AMF, not connected to the SPVM, not connected to anyone Quevillon can reach with a phone call in the right direction. She is connected to an editor who will have your complete file scanned, legally reviewed, and in a publishable state within 72 hours of receiving it. He met Noemi's eyes. Once it's published, recovering the physical documents becomes irrelevant. The information is out. Noemi stared at him. How do you know Isabeau Tremblay-Cote? She wrote a piece 4 years ago about the Rivière Rouge rescue program and the funding cuts that were gutting it. A pause. She quoted me. We've exchanged 3 emails since then. She's honest and she's careful, and she will not bury this. He picked up the canvas bag and held it out to Noemi. This is your call, entirely yours. Noemi took the bag. She held it for a moment, and he could see her thinking, not panicking, thinking, which told him something important about her that the fear had obscured earlier. Then, she put the strap over her shoulder. How do we get to Patrice without crossing their approach line? The north face of the escarpment, Theo said. It's steep and it's ugly, and in the dark, with a headlamp, it's going to be miserable. But it's also not a route that anyone who doesn't know this terrain would try in January, which means they won't be watching it. He opened the door. The cold hit them both like a flat hand. Stay close and step exactly where I step. The crust on the north face is unreliable. What followed was 45 minutes that Noemi would later describe in the article that Isabeau Tremblay-Cote eventually published about her as the most physically demanding experience of her life, including the 2-hour walk in ankle boots that had preceded it. Theo moved across the north face of the granite escarpment with the unhurried precision of someone who had walked this ground in every possible condition of darkness and weather, and she followed him step for step, her arms out for balance, the canvas bag pressing against her ribs with every breath, the cold working its way in through every gap in the borrowed parka. Twice she heard voices behind them, carrying up over the ridge in the still night air. Once she thought she saw a headlamp beam sweeping the tree line below the cabin. She didn't stop walking. They came off the escarpment onto the logging road 1.8 kilometers north of Theo's cabin at approximately 4:40, crossed the road, and pushed through 600 meters of black spruce bog on a trail that Theo navigated from memory. And then the amber light of Patrice Hebert's kitchen window appeared between the trees like something from a dream. Patrice, 91 years old, answered the door in his long underwear and his wool slippers with the expression of a man who had been waiting his whole life for someone to knock on his door at 4:40 in January. Theo, he said, Enfin. The skidoo started on the third pull. The landline worked. Isabeau Tremblay-Cote answered on the fourth ring, and when Theo explained who was on the line and what she had in a canvas bag and why it needed to be out of the Laurentides before dawn, the journalist said, "Give me the address. I'm leaving in 10 minutes." She arrived at Patrice Hebert's property 4 hours later in a rented Subaru with winter tires and a digital scanner in the back seat, and the 2 vehicles on the cut line had been gone for 3 hours by then, pulled back, Theo suspected, the moment their target window closed. Noemi sat at Patrice's kitchen table while Isabeau scanned every page of the file and she answered every question the journalist asked her with the careful precision of someone who had spent 14 months building a case and knew exactly which detail mattered and which was noise. Theo sat in Patrice's other chair and drank his coffee and did not say very much, because it wasn't his story to tell. Patrice, for his part, made a second pot of coffee and a plate of toast and seemed profoundly satisfied with the morning. The article ran 5 weeks later, front page of Le Devoir's Saturday edition, and it was the kind of piece that generates a particular quality of silence in the offices of certain people, the silence of men who have placed very careful phone calls and are now understanding that the calls were not careful enough. The AMF investigation was formally reinstated within 48 hours of publication. The Sûreté du Québec opened a parallel criminal file. A forensic audit firm was appointed by court order to begin asset tracing on Quevillon's 4 shell companies. Gauthier, the compliance officer who had disappeared, was found 6 weeks after the article ran, alive in a rented room in Trois-Rivières. He'd gone to ground on his own initiative, terrified, and hadn't known who to trust enough to surface. When the Sûreté located him, he wept for 20 minutes before he could be interviewed. Nomming Chartrand returned to her work at the AMF, to a reassigned supervisor and a desk that felt slightly different in a way that was hard to articulate but was real. She did not become famous. Financial crime enforcement is not a field that generates the kind of recognition that feels like a reward. What it generates mostly is more work. She accepted that. She had always accepted it. It was the reason she'd chosen the work in the first place. She drove back up to the Laurentides on a Saturday in late March, when the snow was still deep on the north-facing slopes, but the logging road had been graded, and the light in the afternoon was doing what light does in Quebec in March, slanting gold and enormous through the spruce, filling the world with something that feels like a promise just barely capped. She knocked on the cabin door with the canvas bag over her shoulder. The bag was empty now. It had been empty for weeks. Theo answered in his flannel shirt and his wool socks, looking like a man who had been sitting at a table doing something quiet and was not displeased to be interrupted. She held up the bag. "I thought you might want this back. I borrowed it, technically." He looked at it. "I think you can keep it." She stood in the doorway for a moment, and the March light came sideways through the spruce behind her, and Theo Garneau, who had spent 6 years very carefully not making any calls at all, thought that perhaps the thing that had driven him up here, the weight of one wrong decision made in a moment of insufficient information, had finally, somewhere in the last 2 months, quietly let him go. "There's coffee," he said, and he stepped back from the door. Noemi walked in out of the cold. I keep thinking about the moment Noemi's hands finally let go of that bag. Not when she handed it to Isabeau. Not when the article ran. Earlier than that, the moment in the dark of that cabin when her fingers uncurled one by one and she just released it. Released it, the decision of whether to trust someone she had known for 20 minutes. That took something I don't have a clean word for. It wasn't recklessness. It was the opposite of recklessness. It was a woman who had been careful and methodical for 14 months, who had built an airtight case document by document, choosing in one exhausted, freezing moment to extend trust anyway, not blindly but honestly, based on what she could read in a person's eyes and the quality of his silence. I think about the choices that led her to that hollow between the rocks. She could have stayed quiet when Gauthier first came to her. A lot of people would have. Not because they're bad people, but because it's genuinely easier to pass something like that up the chain and let it become someone else's problem. She didn't. She sat with it, built the case, protected the whistleblower as long as she could, and when the system she worked inside bent under pressure, she didn't bend with it. She picked up the bag and drove north. That's not a dramatic decision from the outside. From the inside, it's everything. And Theo. 6 years on that ridge, telling himself he was just living quietly, when really he was waiting for the weight of one wrong call to lift on its own. It doesn't work that way. I don't think the weight ever lifts on its own. I think what actually happens is that you're eventually handed a moment where the cost of staying still finally outweighs the cost of moving, and if you have any decency left in you, you move. Teo moved. He carried her 1.5 kilometers through a January blizzard, and then he sat up all night with his topographic maps and figured out a way through. Not because he owed her anything, because it was the right thing, and he still knew how to recognize the right thing, even after 6 years of deliberate quiet. What stays with me is how the whole thing turned not on force, but on clarity. Noemi had the clarity to build a case that couldn't be ignored. Teo had the clarity to see that the logging road and the cut line and the private airstrip 30 kilometers north were not separate facts, but a single problem with a single window. Isabeau had the clarity to recognize what she was holding and what it was worth and what it would cost to publish it. None of them were fearless. All of them were clear. I think that's what I'd want someone to take from this story, if I'm honest. Not that good always wins, because it doesn't, not automatically, not without people willing to carry the bag through the dark, but that integrity compounds. Noni's 14 months of careful, honest work meant that when the moment came, the evidence was there. Teo's 6 years of knowing that terrain meant that when the moment came, he knew exactly which face of the escarpment they could cross in the dark. The preparation wasn't separate from the courage. It was the form the courage took. Gautier spent 6 weeks alone in a room in Trois-Rivières, terrified, not knowing if anyone was still fighting for what he'd handed over. Someone was. That matters. It matters that someone was.